We would like to invite all the speakers from today who are still around to come up here. We're going to take questions from you for all of these people. So, and we'll start with your question, but give us a second to get our group up here. Nope.
Stay put?
You, this group, this panel remains. You don't get out, well. Also bringing back our moderators here to help out, so. All right, I think we have our group. There was a question over here that. Okay.
And those of you on stage, ask each other questions too.
We can start. Ask
Sure.
Somebody has an answer here. We now have an impressive panel. So
Great, thank you. So the question I have, a lot of the discussion around the autonomous vehicle is focusing on kind of the private commercial monetization aspects and the value creation. I'd like to hear a little more comments on how it's related to public mass transit, interaction of the autonomous fleets, autonomous vehicles. I mean, if you squint at it, they look and sound a lot like mass transit. It's been around for hundreds of years, 100 years. So how can we leverage that infrastructure connection and those value creation opportunities kind of in a public-private basis?
Well, I'll give it a start. One of the things that I think you see happening now is the smart city concept. And the smart city concept is not about autonomous vehicles. It's about the idea of connecting people in communities, allowing them to have access to e-commerce, work, stores, healthcare, et cetera. So it's broader, and because of that broad scope for the smart city, you'll see opportunities to figure out how we leverage mass transit in ways that may not have been used before, whether it's the Hyperloop that one of the colleagues up here may talk about at some point, to first and last mile concepts that may leverage autonomy, but with the goal of connecting people to services ultimately.
And Lee, this has become a big deal now that there are more options for cities. Mm-hmm. One of the purposes of this test in Columbus is to find out which of some of these other options make sense, and it becomes pretty clear that there's not going to be a single answer for every community and city.
Right. This is actually a perfect comment. We at Ricardo have been doing things in the UK that allow cities to take a look at their policies, what they want to implement as a city, put it in a simulation environment, and then read outputs such as how does it impact the community from a greenhouse gas standpoint? How does it impact accidents per 100,000 users? This kind of tool can be used here in the States, where cities are trying to understand the impact of autonomy and autonomous systems, technology in their environment, to understand how best to implement those systems to achieve their policies and ultimately their goals as a city. So you're absolutely right. There are tools out there that are being used that can be adapted to be used to help cities understand how to best implement this technology long term.
Let me take a little bit of a more extreme position on that question, because if you really look at public transportation systems around the world, they are notoriously underutilized and they are money pits. Now, if you look at, tell me any city in the world that really makes money with public transportation systems. If you then look at, and unfortunately Chris is not here, so I'm speaking on his behalf, and Larry Burns, they wrote this fantastic book where they said, hey, you can replace one bus with 20, 25 of these little pods that they created way back when at GM. This is a much, much more economic, much more flexible system. that could make a ton of a difference. And I just give you a very close example here. We had a long debate about the Woodward train that was to be built. Yeah, if you would just turn Woodward into a dedicated lane for autonomous vehicles and put these vehicles to the test here in Detroit, it would make a fundamental difference. Yeah, so I think this is the opportunity that we have with autonomous to create much more flexible systems. But then we have systems like Hyperloop that need to be kind of part of that. Yeah? So you need to have a seamless transition from mode to mode, and people need to enjoy this jumping from mode to mode.
Who's this on the mic? Oh, so I've seen projections off of what he said. I'm sorry, I don't know your name. That says like a subsidized transit rider is about $1 per mile, and that with autonomous technology, this can go down to about 25 cents a mile, which would make it a private business and profitable. So that could really change the game. I've worked with transit agencies. They are incredibly fearful of job losses. So there's going to be some challenges in these kinds of transitions. And right now there's a chicken and egg problem. We have so many car owners in the country, there won't be many transit riders until more people move past car ownership, and they won't do that till the network's good of all the services.
Job losses. I want to comment on the job losses because in my model I actually factored that in as well. So the jobs created by way of this emerging new industry, like just think of Hyperloop, all the jobs created along these new ideas that we can make real are much, much more jobs than we will ever lose in the, let's say, legacy industries that are just not profitable. Now, you want to work for a company that is profitable, you want to work in a place that has a future.
So Dave, I want to ask you, sort of keeping in line with this, okay, as a car designer, you would design cars that we would want to own, right? But we seem to be talking about moving to a place where we wouldn't have that ownership. So how do you change 100 years of what you guys did so very well? Well, just say, keep remembering what you're saying. I don't remember what I was saying. So you get what I'm saying? So how do we get to this mobility future when, you know, we've been raised to want to own cars because you guys designed them to be so appealing?
Well, I'm not sure that's going to be the complete case. I mean, there may be parts of the world where that is. I think that here in North America, you're going to see a transition to, okay, my car is autonomous, but it's my car, right? And I think that's probably the only way the business is going to work to, I'm going to give up having a car altogether, and suddenly this infrastructure is going to be in place and reliable. I still got to get to work when I leave my house to get to work, and then to go get kids or whatever it is I got to do on my time and my schedule. And if autonomous car can make that a little bit safer, or I can do something or nap or whatever it is while I'm driving, that's great. But it's a much larger leap. And I say this especially for North Americans, probably for Western Europeans as well, to then say, now I don't own a car at all. I catch one when I can. And that'll be easy if you live in New York City. And if you live in Milford, Michigan, that's not going to happen for a very long time. I also think that, you know, for a lot of people, just, you know, having the car, as I mentioned a little bit in some of the scenarios, knowing that it's my car with my germs and my stuff in it, and all of that is going to matter quite a bit. So I don't think these things are going to be completely commoditized. I think that there's going to be the you know, absolute basic transportation, sub-Chevrolet, I just need to get across town. It's going to look and feel a lot like a city bus and have those kind of frills. There's going to be something that's going to be maybe something a little more in between, you know, Corolla taxi. And people with money are still going to want nice things. And people with money that want nice things want it to be their things. They don't share well with others. And there's a whole political background I'm not going to get into for that. So I think that there's, you know, there's going to be some steps. And, you know, the car companies have a lot invested in their brands as well. If you're saying brands go away, then the car companies are just plants. And the plants aren't profitable. The brands are profitable. So if there's a way that I can have a Mercedes experience, and maybe this has a lot more to do with what it looks like and feels like on the inside. It's not how, it's not the acceleration or the braking or anything else. But if it's going to be this wonderful, personalized experience, it's going to be valuable to somebody, and they're going to pay more for it.
I think that's what you just mentioned is the, I'm sorry. I think what you mentioned is the key, is the experience. And I know if I had the option of having an on-demand car available to me when I wanted it to take me where I wanted to go, when I wanted to go, I would pay for that versus paying for owning a car. But that's just me. There are probably people like me, a lot of people like me around that would do that as well. But the key would be the experience. If the experience is right, I would sign up to that. And Uber is probably a perfect example. Now, people are taking Ubers everywhere because it's convenient. They can get it pretty much on demand when you want it. And if it's a decent car, you're happier than maybe if it's a minivan that pulls up to you. But it's a little ride, and depending on what's going on and the experience of that system. If I get in the car and it smells and it smells of smoke or what have you, I'm probably not going to do that much often. But if it's maintained, if it's done right, I will take an Uber type on subscription monthly every day of the week and twice on Sunday versus having to deal with gas, maintenance, parking, all of that. I don't want to have time for.
Yes, I actually wanted to say that we did a study on autonomous car also at UCLA with people from BMW and Tesla. And part of the conversation was what you're just saying. And we came up to a conclusion that in this whole conversation, we keep forgetting about people who really do love to drive. There are people who love to drive, and they would like to still have a car. So we were thinking that maybe in the model of a family where right now you look at the house and there's like 2 or 3 or 4 cars sitting on a parking lot or in a driveway, it may be a different model. Maybe it will be just 1 car, and the rest will be, autonomous car that comes, picks you up. But there still is this, I think, will in people to have the freedom to drive, and 2 is to have the spontaneous moment of going on a trip, like Thelma and Louise, and let's take off.
No, but let me be very abrasive again on that comment, because I had the very question like 2 weeks ago from a strategy team at one of the automakers here. How important do you think the brand is going to be? Well, I said, if you call an Uber or a Lyft, how much do you care what brand actually comes to you? Well, you care about it needs to be quick, it needs to be clean, and it needs to take me to where I want to at the fastest route. That's what I care about. So brand, maybe not. Yeah? But on the question of vehicles, I think we are often thinking too incrementally, coming from where we live here in Detroit, because the vehicles will become different vehicles that we drive. If you share mobility, they will look completely different. They will potentially merge with what we want to experience at home. They will merge with what we want to experience while we are on road in the office. Yeah? So they will become rolling offices. I have seen concepts where they combine vehicles with services. So you commute and you have your Starbucks on board, and you kind of create this type of a lifestyle experience. And that's just one example. So I think we need to rethink how we design vehicles completely for a world where people will just use these vehicles for particular purposes or routes.
I think there will be some use. Vehicles will be, or I should say the sharing or the vehicle experience itself will be designed around use. So you may need a utility use because you want to, I don't know if you'll haul an autonomous boat or whatever you're hauling, but you may haul something or go to the cabin for the weekend, and you may need space to do that because you're taking a family. Another use may be just a point A to point B. I think to your point earlier, it doesn't. In that case, the vehicle doesn't matter, and that's what I was touching on. I think with your question earlier, and maybe the numbers are a little bit stronger, but I think the premium market and the premium brands is where the brands still potentially exist and still matter, and where design matters more, both potentially exterior as well as interior.
I think where brands, and this is way down the road in my opinion, but I think where brands are at risk is in the mainstream market. And I think there will be brand consolidation. We don't need all the brands and all the models that we have on the road today existing in this environment. But it also doesn't mean ownership completely goes away. To your point, I would agree completely.
And you don't want
I'm sorry, we will just see the shift from 3 or 4 vehicles down to 1 or 2.
And to add to your thing, Andreas, I actually think the brands become like when you call Uber, okay, yep, I want my luxury experience tonight, I'm going out and I'm all dressed up. I want my family, I need my family van or my sport van.
I need a
Eco, I'm
pickup.
feeling eco today, or I need the utility. So that's more of the brand, I think, is the type of service that you need. And
Let's
experience.
put it to the test. Let's ask Uber to put in a toggle where you can select the brand before you call the vehicle. And then we see how important that is. Yeah?
We could
Can
run
I-
an experiment.
Can I say a few things? So I agree with the sentiment that private ownership will still mean a lot to people, and I could see sort of the blend, like going instead of 3 cars for a family to 2 or 1. From my own personal experience, like I live in Newton, Mass, I can walk a mile to the subway, take that, and then walk another mile to MIT, and so it's a lot of walking, but I enjoy that sort of exercise. But if it was raining and I could take an on-demand vehicle to get me to the mass transit system, then it's sort of a blend. I think you could actually see mass transit system utilization increase, traditional, by having the coupling, the sort of the local experience. And in terms of the user experience, I think that can be branded. I think it is still a challenge, I think, to make an autonomous car drive in a way that the passenger would feel it was like a human driver. Like, I think we still have more to go in terms of learning how to really emulate and match human drivers. And it may be that the user experience and style of driving gets differentiated and keeps brand loyalty. And perhaps as an industry or as a society, we can cooperate on some of the more invisible to the customer aspects in terms of some of the safety systems, and think maybe we can pool data and pool resources so that there's a non-competitive part that's more shared about let's work together to get this dramatic safety problem solved, and then differentiate on the user experience.
We have a question out here, Gary.
Hi, Bill. Great conference today. So since we've got an assurance expert up here and an attorney up here as well, great content today, but I haven't heard something that bothers me every time I see one of these 218-wheelers going down the road in a fleet, automated basis. And I worked in the smart grid and smart cities area for a professional service firm for a while, and a lot of these sensors that are going to be a part of the infrastructure for the future of this advanced mobility are all powered by electricity for the most part, right? So the question comes to my mind, who's paying attention to the risks that could blow this whole thing up, i.e. disasters from natural disasters, lightning strikes taking out transformers or utility stations, terrorist attacks, cyber terrorist attacks, all of these things that could, take this whole dream that we have been seeing up here today, down a rat hole very quickly by having people stranded in automobiles, transportation conflicts, crashing into each other, people getting killed, quite frankly. So where's that in the whole conversation, and who's responsible for mitigation of risk, and in addition to the active safety, what about the reactive safety after a disaster?
Well, let me start and jump in there first with, let's take a look at some of the cybersecurity and kind of critical infrastructure elements. And this is an overlap between critical infrastructure in terms of keeping power running and being able to get power to critical systems, and the cybersecurity element, making sure vehicles are not hackable, or the systems that are connected anywhere in the process are not hackable. First off, in the guidelines, NHTSA recently recognized and made it abundantly clear that when they are talking about any system that has any level of autonomy whatsoever, it is the full value chain that they're going to be talking about. Everything from the software provider to the cloud services host to the folks at Uber or whatever taxi type service, to the OEM, to the tier 1, to the tier 20 supplier. So number one, from an accountability standpoint, NHTSA has made it clear that everybody has to be on board and involved. Who's doing it? We do have the Auto ISAC pushing a lot of different, I guess, doing that collection of data and information, a lot of the sharing of some of the threats and vulnerabilities. The great thing about the Auto ISAC, it's kind of a collection of data points of what's going right, what's going wrong. If you're not familiar with the ISAC, it's set up so that any antitrust issues of sharing that kind of competitive information, that's swept away. They can do this information sharing in a very free system. So you have the ISAC collecting a lot of information and trying to turn that into best practices. The OEMs are adopting some of the concepts coming out, and I know the tiered supply base will probably hear about that in the next 6 to 12 months, things that they can do on their end in designing the products and keeping their systems safer. But even at a more immediate level in terms of some of the cybersecurity and attacks standards, a lot of the standard organizations have been working on security and privacy, kind of the two sides of the coin. SAE has been heavily involved with 3061, J3061. There's ISO 26262. These guys are going to be working together to kind of create an updated J3061 that has a lot more meat to the bones. So keep an eye to the standards organizations. They're working on this. The government is keeping a very close eye on this as well, and they've set up the infrastructure for a lot of sharing to go on.
And I think it's the big elephant in the room in some way, because you need something like a command center. Yeah, we have kind of autonomous vehicles in use today for other purposes, but this country is uniquely positioned to use these command centers to manage fleets of vehicles in a city. You need to supervise them. You need to understand if somebody vandalizes them. You need to understand if somebody hacks them. And for that purpose, you need a command center.
So, John, let me ask you, how much autonomy is on board resident in the vehicle versus how much does the vehicle need to communicate with the cloud?
Well, I'll say the general approach, for example, Google have been very public that the car has everything it needs on board. It doesn't need to communicate with the cloud to do its job. And in general, I think that's part of the sort of you'd want to have a fail-safe design so that if cloud connectivity is lost, the system can still behave well. In general, I would say like some of the sort of more cataclysmic disasters, like earthquakes or so forth, God, that's really hard to answer. But just in general, if you think about deployment, I wonder if if we really could get a radical reduction in injuries or fatalities, could you imagine something like the vaccination model, where there's sort of a central liability pool, and heaven forbid, the small cases where something bad happens, that it's something that's sort of shared more collectively across the industry, or society sort of takes that on with the direct benefit of that tremendous reduction in accidents, which we think is possible. But that will take some sort of collective will.
So are we going to have the collective will? Anybody?
I can see a return to the Model T. It's sort of cyber-proof and we'll get you there no matter what.
Well, we do have the ISACs right now. So the ISAC exists. Most of the OEMs are participants. A lot of the big tier ones are participants. Booz Allen is running it. They have their command center down in Virginia. So, I mean, we do have a start on it. A lot of the great minds who are involved in designing conceptually the OBD ports have been participating in sharing their lessons learned. You have a lot of the hacktivist conferences. You've got a lot of people engaging bug bounties. The programs, your miles may vary, and I have personal views on trying to hire black hat hackers. They don't like that model, even if they are truly white hat in nature. They really don't like to be employed. There's just something about the freedom and mobility that they have that makes it challenging for us to bring them into the fold. But looking at tactics like that, trying to figure out the best way to look at the next best thing, use the ISAC, and going through these standards organizations to set up best practices.
Yeah, well, first, the one thing that I was glad to hear was that the comment relative to a driver all of a sudden being put in a position to have to stop what they're doing and begin to control the vehicle when
most drivers have trouble controlling the vehicle when they're paying attention to it 100%. So that's good. And I've heard a lot of good conversation about city planning and urban centers and congestion and all of that. But the one thing that I haven't really heard a lot of comment on and I'm just curious about is most of the cities that I've been in, most of the areas that I've been in, we've got a huge population of suburbanites that commute to the urban areas, urbanites that commute to the suburban areas, suburbanites that commute to suburban areas for whether they're shopping, working, having fun, whatever they're doing, okay? And that kind of relates back to some of the conversation we heard about, you know, private ownership. So when I'm in my private car and I'm living in Milford, where do I stop my private car along the lodge so that I can then join some of the stuff that we've been talking about here? Can we get some comments in that area?
You don't want to stop in the lodge, but
Yeah.
it's,
No, I think it points directly to a new industry, I think, that is emerging right now, and that is the management of transportation in a city. So you need to look at this holistically from a kind of what are all the modes of transportation that are available, and how do I make this experience that you were just describing the most seamless and enjoyable experience you can get, you know? And for that, you need to rethink the entire transportation system of a city. You cannot kind of go from where we are today to this future world in one step.
I think, you know, and what you just talked about, I mean, a couple of things. I mean, the whole world's changing. It's not just that we're going from this kind of car ownership to something else. We have Amazon.com bringing us stuff. We have more things coming to us. Doctors are coming to us. We have a whole changing thing happening around how we move and how we access things in our world. And for us that have owned cars in America, lived in suburbia, it's hard to imagine going from this car ownership model to this thing new, this network approach, because the network approach, I think of it like almost being in a hotel and pushing a button and wanting an elevator. And a network of elevators will come and give you a ride. We don't wait a half hour for an elevator, and we wouldn't be waiting a half hour for a self-driving Uber. It would be out there circling around in Milford, waiting for the call to come in from you, and then you would get this ride. So it's a big switch from how we know how we get around from this car ownership model. But you know, the thing is, I'm not a technologist, but when you look at the Google self-driving car or the Mercedes car, you know, we heard Doug Field last night talking about Apple Computer, and the first Macintosh had something like 124K memory. It was like the first Macintosh. Well, we're all looking at the first Macintosh right now. We're all looking at the wimpiest, lowest performance self-driving vehicle that humans will ever know. And you know, we're going into a world where it's going to be very dramatically different. But it's exciting, and for me, it's really exciting because this network approach of mobility with self-driving vehicles also performing more like transit in certain applications, but the whole idea is it's a lower cost service, I mean, substantially lower cost, 1/5 the cost. You're going to get there a lot faster. I can imagine in 25 years there's vehicles going between Detroit and Chicago. The 2 lanes became 3 lanes or 4 lanes because computers can drive just a couple of inches from each other. So we're going into a very different world.
I would just add to it, I guess specific to your question, if we think of a city or a city center maybe where it's only robo-taxis that are allowed. So to your point, what do you do? So let's say you have your vehicle, or let's just say you have an owned autonomous vehicle that you take. I don't think it'd be that different than you taking it to you know, what's in Europe today or in other city centers where you have a park and ride, and you're then you know, you're bussed in. In this case, you're potted in or something until you get into that environment. So I think you know, maybe in the interim you could see something like that happen.
Can I ask a question as well?
Sure.
I have a question for Marta, actually. I have another dream. I always wanted to have a house on the lake. And we have this beautiful Lake Michigan here up north. And so I was thinking, is it viable to have a Hyperloop from Detroit to Traverse City and then we just use the mobility on demand autonomous for the last leg to my house. So how viable, or what is the minimum distance that you need to have for a Hyperloop system? And what would we need to put on the table to make that happen?
So we were discussing the distances, and we came with a conclusion that probably 250 miles distance between two cities is absolute minimum to make the best out of the system and the speed. And that's even kind of borderline low. So 300 miles would be probably ideal, and up. But then when we're going up and then we're adding time for travel, then we have to start thinking about adding infrastructure. And the whole conversation about having a bathroom in the capsule, it's a huge problem because it affects basically everything that's happening inside and the layout and whether we have an aisle or no. So that adds additional complications.
So 300 miles is exactly right. So that's about the distance. So how much would we need to invest to make that happen?
Oh, that's not a question for me in terms of investment because I'm from the architecture point of view. So you would have to probably speak to the company that we worked with. But speaking of which, they're actually looking into different and kind of new ways of monetizing Hyperloop because they really want to keep the tickets very low at $30 or less. So they have to be very creative of how do you kind of monetize on that. So some of the ideas we had were, for example, if you're riding for 30 minutes, well, you may not spend time like watching a movie because it's just such a short amount of time, but maybe on the go in the station you can pick up a gadget or an iPad or something that you can test for the length of a 30-minute and drop it off on the other station. So in a way, the companies that are participating in that kind of system would be, of course, part of the larger kind of ecosystem, financial ecosystem.
Doesn't answer the money question.
No. Money is not for me.
I got a question for the audience, okay? So you've been sitting here all day and you've been hearing people talk about 2025, we're going to have fully autonomous vehicles. How many of you think that you will have access to an autonomous vehicle in 2025? Just show of hands. And how many of you think you won't have access to an autonomous vehicle in 2025? Wow. So what do you guys make of that? Anybody?
I think access is the key word there.
It depends how you define
I
access.
think it will.
Yeah.
So,
And also
And I think if we
autonomous.
asked
What do you
next
mean
year,
by
almost
autonomous?
everyone's hand would go up.
I think there's a big difference between autonomous mobility as a service in local areas versus privately owned vehicles that will sit in your driveway, and I think that they're very different paths for those. And but I think you can, if you want to fly to Singapore, you can have access to the autonomy system in Singapore today. In Pittsburgh, Uber is giving selected customers access today. There's a great video of 2 Pittsburgh Steelers that took an Uber ride through Pittsburgh. So depending on how you define access, it might exist today.
I would agree.
My question has to do with globalization. So a lot of us in the automotive industry, we have a global reach, and most of the discussion about the regulations seems to have been about U.S., state to state. What's being done to really interface with Europe, with China? What's being done to reduce the complexities that products built here can easily be adapted or used in other regions?
Harmonization has been a thorn in everyone's side for as long as there have been different countries. I think what I've heard in recent years, and even as far as a couple weeks ago, when a small group of us got together from 5 or 6 different organizations. We had SAE, IEEE, and a few others. We were even just talking about domestic harmonization of different standards amongst the groups. The comment was, well, what do we do about the globalization and true global harmonization? There's been a lot of outreach from Europe. There's been a lot of outreach from China to try to push some of the standards that they're currently developing and have the U.S. buy in. But I think really it's been more of a rejection on our side of some of the solutions that have been drafted by each of those particular, either nations or blocks of countries. So I think it's always a challenge. I think that is a problem that I don't see a good solution for anytime soon. Anybody else?
Yeah, no,
see a good
absolutely.
solution?
I think I have been part of discussions for the preparation of Davos on this topic, autonomous vehicles. And one of the key schemes that came up was it is a race of not only technology but also legislation. So the countries that are faster in putting together the framework that allows this technology to become mainstream are going to be a step ahead. And so it's not only developing the best technology, but also creating the framework to make this happen. And if we are not careful here, we will lose out on that because we cannot afford to have 47 different sets of legislation.
Yeah, I have to follow up on this. It's so true. We very quickly came to realization that Hyperloop happening in the US as a first probably test country, it's not going to happen. Most likely it's going to be some other place, and that's why they're looking at Middle East, they're looking at China, they're having a lot of conversation with really a lot of other countries that you just can, basically all you need is a yes from the sheikh, right? Or a yes from the government, versus here, look at the high-speed rail between Los Angeles and San Francisco. It's been going on for like 6 years and it's still not there. And again, it's the legislation, it's the politics that kind of holds off. And I agree, if we want to pioneer transportations and be on top of the world, we really have to change that first. And to pick up a little bit on the standardization, it's also interesting with Hyperloop because this is also a completely new system that relies heavily on infrastructure that is not done, unlike an autonomous car that can drive on the roads that we already have. Here we're talking about infrastructure and basically tubes and pipes and setting them up for the first time. So anytime you change the size, it's going to create tremendous problems, including stations that have to kind of function in the same manner to be able for the capsule to come to the station and turn around. How do you do this? So all of this system would have to kind of follow some kind of standardization from the get-go. So this is something unique position for us, was to think about all these solutions, because we knew that whatever we come up with, this would have to be implemented. If we wanted to connect the entire world, this is how it would have to be implemented across the entire globe. The reality check is that now there are 2 companies that are doing Hyperloop, and they're competing. And what's interesting, they're also using completely 2 different technologies. So I'm very curious how that race is going to come up, because it seems that even though in ideal world you would want to have the same system, I don't think it actually will be possible.
I think around the world, in terms of the different countries, the countries that may not have a very big auto industry, that may not lose I'm back to losing jobs, they may go faster. But you know, the way things change, I mean, first thing, the car companies that are going into space, I mean, it's not just dealing with consumers here, it's dealing with cities and government. And that's a kind of a really new equation for companies, to think that it's not just if they have the right product, it's what the city might vote they want. And so certain cities may see things like Singapore, or they may see things happening, or they may go over there and experience that, and that might be a part of that equation. I mean, the first bike share system in Paris, the big one of 20,000 bikes, was copied within a year to a Chinese city and doubled in size. And so it's really kind of interesting. And for us in the auto industry, it's funny to think back about how change comes, because I tell people, I talk about like airbags. I said, who brought airbags into commercialization? Somebody that loved airbags or somebody who hated airbags? And people say, well, of course, somebody loved airbags, and of course it's wrong. It was Lee Iacocca who fought them all along the way until he had a bunch of K cars he couldn't sell, and he put airbags in them. So how things happen like this is really kind of hard to predict, and we may have bad news on the climate 2 years from now, some more catastrophic news, so that 1-2 punch could really change things as we know it, how these things unfold.
Dave, let me ask you, when you spent time as a designer around the world, there were other types of cars than we have here, like the key cars in Asia, right? So the thing I wonder about is that, we're talking about autonomy, and it's sort of like, okay, we're all going to have autonomous Malibus, we're going to have, autonomous Camrys or whatnot. Okay, we're just looking at the existing cars saying, okay, we're going to make that autonomous. Do you think that moving to a new model of control of the vehicles would allow the creation of a new model of types of vehicles? So the architecture would change more radically than we've seen in quite some time.
That's a great question, and I think that you spend time in any design school that has transportation design, and you see it already. As the way that a vehicle is designed right now has everything to do with passengers facing forward and survivability of an accident. In fact, you think of just about any other kind of transportation is not designed to hit a wall at 40 miles an hour and have you walk away, right? Not airplanes, not buses, not trains, not anything else. It's kind of crazy. And even if it's a giant black sedan or a little micro car in the Japanese domestic market, they all have those kinds of rules. So the fact that people don't necessarily have to face forward. I mean, I remember, riding in the back of rear-facing seats in a station wagon, getting a little car sick when I was little. So I'm not. But you look at a nice train, where you can sit and have a conversation, and you're not really worried about looking out what's happening in front of you. In fact, for a lot of people, the trust with autonomous vehicles, you may not want to know. You look out the window. I think, having some light and being able to get the environment as you're moving is really important for the inner ear so you don't get sick. I mean, I think that's probably one of the big challenges that they'll find with the Hyperloop. That's why it's really nice to see that, when your eyes and your inner ear don't agree with each other, bad things happen. But that said, I think that, yeah, I mean, electric cars where batteries can be packaged in different places and the electric motor can be more within the wheels or the wheel hubs and things like that. I mean, it really can transform the vehicle. I mean, as a car stylist, I like how the Tesla looks. I think it's a very pretty car. If it had a Jaguar badge on it, I'd go, yeah, okay, that makes sense. Knowing that it's a fully electric vehicle, and the fact that it just kind of looks like a good-looking car is a real missed opportunity because it could have been far more dramatic. And hopefully they will be. But I think that the big change is going to be, and I don't know from either an engineering or a legal standpoint where we get with this, but at some point, the cars just aren't going to get in as many accidents. And it'll be more like the number of major accidents that buses get into or airplanes. Okay, and at that point, you think about cars today, it's most of the cost and most of the mass is for safety systems because there's this crazy idea that this thing can hit a wall at 40 miles an hour and you can walk out, right? It's amazing that they're as safe as they are and yet not safe enough. At some point, and this is probably has a lot more to do with, I'll say, legal/consumers having the level of trust, that you'll get into these vehicles and they'll have the same safety systems as a motorcycle or a city bus, which is none. Right? There won't be there won't be even be seatbelts necessarily, which is a little hard for us to get our head around. But at some point, it may be so safe that that's okay, because as soon as you take all those safety systems out of the vehicle, it's going to weigh much less. It's going to cost far less. And the idea of being more efficient from a power use and from a resource use is a huge part of the promise here. And at that point, when you can take the safety systems out of the vehicle, it's not going to look like anything that you're used to, and that's going to be a pretty radical change. None of these things necessarily allow it to be the prettiest thing in the world. Mercedes just showed a concept at Pebble Beach that was, meant to be a future vision, electric autonomous, and it looked like a modern interpretation of a Bugatti from the 1930s. As a designer, I thought it was gorgeous, but as somebody who is interested in this space, I also thought it was ridiculous as well. But it was really pretty. So I guess the short version of this is I think that it's going to be when the tipping point is going to be when the safety systems aren't as necessary, and the vehicles just don't crash into each other, which probably means there's no actual humans driving and it's just pure autonomy. That's when you're going to see a radical change in the look of the car.
Let me follow up with John. So do you see this as being conceivable in the next 10, 15 years, that as he's suggesting, you take the safety systems out because the car is intrinsically safe?
I think that's a long way off. And
It's in buses today.
It's in buses today, but right now we've got to account for NHTSA's view of things and how likely those regs are to be repealed. I mean, the FMVSS are 200 deep, and really, the requirements are there. We're going to have to back away from this entire culture of safety, this high dollar recall mentality, before we get a chance to even pull back any of those regs. So I think time-wise, you're probably at least looking 20, 25 years.
I'd say that, sorry, briefly, if we can achieve such a high level of safety that we can think about removing the passive safety features of vehicles, that would be a really nice problem to have.
But again, I think we need to think out of the confines of just looking at the vehicle. Because at the end of the day, a vehicle needs a road. And if we had dedicated lanes for vehicles exclusive to vehicles that are equipped with autonomous technology, that are equipped with, let's say, charging technology in the streets, with kind of connectivity built into the streets, and you are paying for driving on this lane. So you would pay for a Tesla on a whatever. You pay, instead of paying 50 cents per mile for a Tesla, you pay 75 cents if you can use this dedicated lane. And I would pay for this, especially if I live on the West Coast and spend like much more than these 113 hours in traffic inefficiencies. I would really pay for it because it's time for me. And the lanes would have 5 times the capacity of a lane of a street that you see today. So it would also save money for those building those lanes. So I think it can be there earlier, but we would need dedicated city regions and dedicated lanes to make it happen.
And lobbying of Congress.
Or a country that is just faster.
I fear that to be the truth.
On the car styling, I taught last year, and so we did this project, an autonomous vehicle with car design students, and it's really interesting because when you drive a car, Chris Bangle was the head of BMW design, would talk about this, and a car basically is an avatar. So, if you're buying a car, you basically buy a car that you think looks okay, or you just feel like it's right for you, it's the right price, all that. But if I have a friend who has, let's say, a yellow VW Beetle, and they come around the corner 3 blocks down there, and I see the Beetle, like, oh, there's Susie. And it's like, I can't see her body. I can only see her because she's in this much bigger vehicle, this big car. So we buy our cars because they're avatars, and we operate these cars. So we're like with a toaster, we can burn bread, and with our car, we can go up to Traverse City at 80 miles an hour, and we can do all this amazing stuff. But when you have a self-driving car come to you that may not even have a front window, all the cars that we buy have headlights and the mouth grill. I mean, there was the big fight at Tesla, should have a mouth grill, because somehow with our avatars, we like mouths and eyes on our avatars. So I do think when this does start to unfold and we see more of these vehicles, car design will change really more dramatically than we think.
No other questions?
Well, so I have a question. So you're talking about paving specific lanes for these things, and it was occurring to me as you were talking, it's just like, well, why not just build a Hyperloop? I mean, if we're going to have this big infrastructure project, of course, they have to figure out how to make it shorter. So, we under 300 miles.
Different speeds.
Why don't you think people are on a Hyperloop, but they're actually on a 90-mile-an-hour bus vehicle going to Traverse City?
Right, or you got individual pod cars that, because they're autonomous, they can platoon together, and you can drive them at higher speeds using less room on the freeways, enabling more capacity for more vehicles on the existing infrastructure. The challenge with going from current vehicles to the autonomous self-driving and having isolated lanes is the infrastructure, the cost of doing this. And we can't get our roads fixed. We got potholes all over the place. We can't fix
drive home
those.
from here and
Yeah, right. So that kind of radical change to make that happen may take a lot of time. And again, it's a perception issue. How many people are going to be willing to not have seat belts and airbags and such in vehicles? People aren't willing to get in cars necessarily that are controlled by computers. Now you're going to tell them, not only are you going to get in this car that's controlled by a computer, but I'm going to take all the safety stuff out. I'm going to ramp up your speed. You're going to follow another vehicle at 3 meters away, and it's going to be all good. So that's a challenge. So you have the perception issue, you have the legal issues. That FMVSS document is ginormous, and it's a pain, but those are the requirements today. So you have a lot of built-in inertia that you're going to have to overcome in order to get to that. Now, I agree with what everybody is saying. Once that happens, things can look and be different. But it is a major change as to what we're doing.
But to Dave's point, though, you know, we all get on trains and we all get on buses, and nobody looks for the seatbelts, right? And you know, we don't know who's driving this thing, or if anybody's driving this thing. We're just, what the hell, get on, right?
Right.
But buses usually win.
Yeah.
But
almost all the time.
But does anybody even, I mean, does anybody even think about that? You know what I mean? It's just like, okay, so I mean, there are lots of people still in the United States, I was looking at some accident statistics recently that don't buckle their seatbelts, right? I mean, they just don't. And there are lots of states in the union that do not have that as a primary cause for which you can get a traffic infraction.
I think it also goes back a little bit to, you need to experience it. So I give you one example. I was in Europe and I was driving a kind of a level 2.5 vehicle for about 500 miles. It was a bliss. So I was driving very fast. It was in Germany, so at around 150 miles per hour. And I was putting it on autopilot. Yeah? And the way it accelerated, the way it deaccelerated was so smooth that I felt much, much safer than I would have if I had driven the car myself. Then I came back to the States and I came into my vehicle. I had unlearned to pay attention. After 500 miles, I just couldn't all the things that you do not thinking about it, I had unlearned. But the experience was phenomenal. And I think if we then drive in those vehicles, a lot of this angst will go away.
Yeah, I actually have to agree with that. It goes back to this first experience, which I think is the most important. And we're talking about it with Hyperloop as well, because if people get into on the capsule and they feel nauseous, or they feel claustrophobic, or there's some kind of discomfort, what is the likelihood that they will take it again? Well, not really high, right? So the first experience is very crucial. That it's really finalized. It's really perfect in every single sense, like your experience. And that goes back to something what Doug was talking about yesterday in his lecture. And he said, when I held the iPod for the first time and I downloaded that first iTunes song, and when I felt the iPhone for the first time, it felt right. And that feeling, that great feeling, I think goes back to this first experience. So I think that's the strive for making it right for the first time.
And there are also facts. If you look at the facts, we pay in the US about 120 billion worth of for our crashes, 120 billion. If we take out product liability, etc., and then say 50% of the vehicle is driven by the driver and 50% by the machine, and then you take out of the machine aspect of it, what a vehicle would never do. It would never drive too close to another vehicle. It would never run a red light. It would never run a stoplight. It would never drive drunk. It would simply not do these things. The residual risk that we would need to insure is just about $113 per vehicle. $113 in comparison to up to $1,400 of warranty that we set aside for vehicles today.
I do think the challenge, and I think that's great data and insight, is you take that vehicle and put other people like myself and others in that same environment, and all of the benefit of that vehicle doing the right thing is offset by me doing the wrong things. So if you have those two that have to coexist, you have a problem. You do have to isolate them to get that kind of benefit.
All right, another audience question. Let's say an autonomous vehicle drove up outside right now and it could take you home, okay? No driver, it just drove up. How many of you would get into that vehicle right now? No. It's you got to drive down the Southfield or Telegraph, Michigan Avenue, okay? So that's so how many would you get in? How many would get in that car?
The assumption is it works.
Right.
Wow.
I would.
You got a lot of work to do. All these people are depending on what you're up to. So, Kristen, is there a good business case for a corporation that has legacy systems to even think about this whole space?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think that they have to think about this space because the world is changing. And as we've just talked about today, transportation, I look at it as more accessibility, mobility as a service. Cars will still be there, but their purpose will be changed. And I think that if you look at the revenue opportunity between this whole mobility space, they have to get into it. And so they are. And I think they do have opportunity. But as we've talked about earlier, there are challenges to overcome. And you know, some will be more successful than others. And it's true, the vehicle itself might become just a commodity. And you know, time will tell.
How do the designers feel about that?
Yeah, if I wanted to design toasters, I would have gone into toaster design. No, like I said, I think that you know, people, you know, they're different different consumers with different ability to pay and what they want and how specific they want it. And I think there's always going to be a market for that. I think that brands won't necessarily matter. You know, if you're in an area where and I can't imagine this in the States, where you're not allowed to privately own a vehicle. I mean, maybe in New York City or places like that where it really is, they want more usage than just occasionally one person. But I suppose if you have your own parking spot and all of that, who are you hurting? But I do think that there's still going to be different levels. There may be most of the market may be commoditized. I think that the luxury end of it, it's still going to be very important that somebody feels special during that time as well, if they're willing to pay for it. I think that we can imagine all new ways for somebody to feel special if they're not driving. I guess one question I would have for the team here, since I have the mic, is if we think that most cars aren't used. I mean, I forget what it was. 90%.
4%.
Yeah.
Are used.
Only 4%.
4% utilization.
Right. So, what do we think a reasonable level is of supply and demand on that? I mean, I know that when I have to, you know, when I call for an Uber and I have to wait 15 minutes, or they've doubled the price because it's a spike, or all the rest of that. Like, if 4% isn't right, what is the right number? Any idea where we should be for this to be something where people are still, you know, not having to wait for transportation, but it's still in circulation?
Targeted at a 50-60% utilization, and when you think about it, if you have fully autonomous capability, you don't have the limitation of having enough drivers. And so you can look over, you know, your data analysis of time and locations of people picking up and what that journey looks like throughout the day in, let's say, a city or a location, and really get good analytics to help you optimize then your fleet. So I think that from what I've heard is that 50 to 60% is probably a reasonable target, and we'll have
And
to
if
see.
you use taxis in New York as a benchmark, it's actually 76%. So they are utilized 76% of their usable
certain
time.
areas will be
Yeah,
higher,
yeah. And but that is a dense urban environment. So the more you move into the rural Medford example, you move towards the 50%.
Although there's not a whole lot of cleaning time used for New York taxis.
That sanitation.
That sanitation is a bit of an issue.
UV light we need.
That's how well they managed to do with all those little Crown Vics, you know, just
I know.
just imagine.
Junkyards.
We have I think, a final question from the audience here.
Then it's an honor to ask the question. You're talking about we are going in the direction of getting the commoditized society and vehicles and brands that is kind of disappearing. So the differentiator becomes user experience. We, I think, all kind of can agree that in our industry, we don't hold the competence of that. I sense somehow through the conversation today that we are giving away a lot of revenues out of our industry who will be controlled by somebody who has much more fixed expertise in that user experience field. How does the panel actually see this being held back and getting it back in our court? Because it's predominantly, it's almost reminding me of the PC industry. It's not about who sells the hardware. It's just one single black box, and everything what we pay, it's haven't maybe been chosen by a user itself. So just an opinion, how you guys feel about that?
Agree 100%. It's it is really a function of what additional services, experiences can you offer on the journey to the various destinations, work or fun or home, to people to generate revenue. Yeah, it's also, if you look at Google filed a patent where stores can pay for your trip. And I think that's a perfect example of how they think they will make money.
Royalties, royalties, royalties. Yeah. I think understanding and providing the platform for the content, you've got to look at it as a royalty-based system. If you are giving access to media companies, to stores, look at the royalty as a possible access point for monetization.
At that point, let's give a hand to this magnificent panel here. Before we go, I would like to thank our sponsors and exhibitors who made this possible today. That would be Continental, Dassault Systems, Detroit Public Television, Infor, Intel, Mich Auto, the Michigan Economic Development Corporation, Mobile Technology Association of Michigan, the Original Equipment Suppliers Association, Ricardo and SAE International, and of course Autobeat Daily and Automotive Design and Production, who have been your hosts today. I want to thank you all for attending, and at this point we are adjourned. Thank you.